Welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. We're excited to bring you season 3 of new episodes featuring in-depth content across Singapore, ASEAN and the United Kingdom. We've had some extraordinary guests on our channel, including Formula One's Claire Williams.
I'm a firm believer that any great team, any successful team has a great culture flowing through it. You aren't successful if you don't. So we put a lot of work into this.
Renowned mountaineer Kenton Cool.
That 2019 there with a client, a big storm came in and literally destroyed Camp 2. And I've got some video footage of Sherpas like trying to hold on to the tent fabric as it blows away. And
the Royal Navy's Commodore Steve Morehouse, commander of the UK Carrier Strike Group.
The squadron of F-35 aircraft we have on board is a Royal Air Force squadron, and the personnel there are drawn from both the Navy and the Air Force. So what better way of showing just the efficiency and the joined-up nature that we now have.
And distinguished Sky News anchor Jeremy Thompson.
We had 2 little vans with satellite links, and we leapfrogged up the road to Pristina, the capital, throughout that first day, with non-stop coverage from basically inside a war zone.
We also sit down with the likes of TikTok, Twitch and Twitter and continue to bring you conversations around business and trade, leadership and people, sustainability, sports and arts and much, much more. Thank you, as always, for your support, and we hope you enjoy this podcast.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the British Chamber's Information and Communication Technology Committee podcast, this time on the subject of the future of work. My name is Graham Lim. I'm the Senior Partner Manager for Globalisation Partners, an employer of record platform globally. And with me, I have 3 fantastic guests, Janelle Gavin, who is the Regional HR Manager for APAC and ANZ of Mott Macdonald, Rob Squires, the Vice President and Head of Sales of APJ of Ceridian, a leading US human HCM software firm, and Vidya Santhanam, the co-founder and CEO of Fitbots, an up-and-coming OKR software and coaching startup headquartered in Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob, Vidya, and Janelle. Maybe I might give each of you an opportunity to quickly introduce yourselves, please. Starting alphabetically with Janelle.
Hi everyone, Janelle Gavin, and based here in Singapore with Mott Macdonald, and really looking forward to speaking with my fellow podcasters on this session today. Thank you. I might hand over to Rob.
Hi everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So Rob Squires, I head up a company called Ceridian in Asia. We're a global HCM technology company servicing many customers around the globe with HCM technology. So great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Vidya.
Hey everyone, my name is Vidya. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Fitbots. We're an OKRs company. I also have this little joke running at home which says every time I say OKRs, I have my golden retriever pup actually bark. So that's the number of times I actually say it in a day. My past life, I used to lead strategic talent and leadership building for $1 billion company named Mindtree, and moved away from the warmth of the herd to set up Fitbots.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. It's great having all of you here. In this podcast, what we are really trying to talk about here is the future of work. We've all gone through the pandemic for the past 2.5, gosh, it's longer than that now. And in the context of HR, we've had to make transformations and changes which have been unprecedented. Now the world is shifting back into returning to the office. Travel is opening up again, and yet we have had a lot of lessons concerning what it would have meant to manage a remote workforce, no matter where we are out there in the world. And with that, it was important for us to get the view from the beginning of an HR practitioner. And in this regard, we wanted to also ask how it would feel for someone who's actually dealing with HR issues on the ground, what that translated to in terms of everyday experience with managing a workforce in the pandemic. And so then the first question is for you, Janelle. Janelle, as a HR manager, what are the sort of challenges that you felt were pretty pertinent when you were managing a workforce in the pandemic?
Yeah, great question, Graham. I think, if we can reflect back, it's 2.5 years since the pandemic really kicked off, and to say that it's over would be a falsehood as well. We're still seeing that impact in many of our countries. I think for Mott Macdonald, we were one of the first regions. We certainly have China within our region, and then that flow-on effect that came through across Asia and into Australia and New Zealand. And we saw most of our offices shut down in a very small space of time to have to work remote. We saw ourselves going into lockdowns, and we're talking within our region, it was 2,500 people globally across our company. It was close to nearly 16,000 employees having to revert from being in an office to what felt like almost overnight to working from their homes. Huge shift for us as a business, and not only as a business, but a huge shift in the way we would manage and the way we would lead our teams, because those micro moments that we have with our people suddenly were non-existent because we all had to try and interact with people through technology. Now, we were very fortunate at the time. We had systems set up such as MS Teams, where we could actually connect with our people very quickly through video. And we had actually embarked on a journey, I think it was about 12 months before, where we had, certainly in this region, we'd started to convert people to using laptops instead of these desktop computers. So we had already become a fairly agile workforce, with many of our offices always working in an agile way. But you know what happened is that as we shifted through those very first early stages where we were reacting to the situation around us, what we ended up getting into was this situation of where it started to become the normal way in which we worked. We became recognizing that the offices weren't going to open in 2 or 3 months' time. And we quickly became aware that even if those offices did open, we could very quickly revert back into a lockdown. So we had to very quickly not only adapt to an agile way of working through the pandemic, but we had to continue that agile way of working in everything that we did moving forward. And what has now been a journey of what are we here now, nearly 2.5-year journey of that adaptation. One of the things that I do reflect on is if we looked back and someone had said to me 2.5 years ago that all of our offices would be working to the extent of agile working they are now, I would have laughed, because it just was not the way of working in so many of our locations. There was still a view that we had to work together. The thought of agile working was quite hard. How would we connect? How would we continue to be productive? How would we interact with our clients? All of these were front of mind. But what we've learned is that we can do many of those things remotely. However, there are also a number of those things that we do miss when we're working in that way. And that connectivity with people, and that connectivity with our leaders, and the connectivity with our business as a whole, the culture, the values, the purpose that the business has. And not only, they're the internal type things about our business, but also the adaptation of how do we keep that connection with our clients as well. So it's a very broad topic, but it fundamentally comes down to the connection. How do we stay connected with our people, whether we are a leader as a whole of a business, with our clients? And as the pandemic continued, one thing that really came front of mind for us was around that onboarding and the training of new people. We were onboarding so many people, yet we had never physically met them in person. They had been interviewed, they were onboarding, and we were continuing to work. And for some people, this has been a journey of more than 12 months where they have never physically met any of their colleagues in person. And one of the things that really started to come to mind for us around this was, how do we continue to onboard people? We can onboard them with the systems. We can send a computer to their house. We can get them logged on. We can train them online. But how do we retain the connection with team, with their peers, with their leaders? And how do they build their networks within the business when they don't have those people necessarily around them, or they don't have those micro moments where we could just turn around to our colleague next to us and say, hey, I've got this problem. Who do you suggest I could call? What we were finding instead was that it became a lot more structured in the way we started to interact with people. So the first point there was about onboarding and training new people, and a real question around how can we use technology not just to onboard a person insofar as giving them the technology and giving them the systems and training them on the systems, but finding a way to create a connection with the business, with their leaders and with their colleagues. The other issue that we started to identify was, how do we also enable our leaders to engage and to support our people? And I mentioned before about that, those interactions, those micro moments were suddenly becoming a lot more structured. And the feedback that we were getting from our leaders tended to be, my whole day is being built up of meetings after meetings. It might be 15 minutes, it might be half an hour. But instead of having these small micro conversations with the people around me, with my teams, we're actually now having to structure time into our calendars. And what they were finding was that their whole day was starting to be built up with meetings with people just wanting information from them. And it was a real challenge. And if I reflect back pre-COVID, we would often say to our leaders, structure time with your people, build in time so that you can have that time with them. We did that back then because we also could supplement that with those micro moments that people had. But what we now didn't have was those micro moments, and those meetings started to become longer. And yes, it's good that they're spending time with their people, but it's only so good as both parties can continue to engage in the conversations and neither party feels particularly burdened. And I did have some leaders saying, I spend my daytime hours answering questions because people need my time, and I spend my evenings doing the work that I need to do, and I'm starting to feel burnt out. So it's not a good balance for our people or for our leaders, if all of this time is becoming so structured that we start to become burdened by this and we start to feel that burnout. So the second question that we had there was around, how do we continue to support our leaders to engage with our people, but without it being having to be in such a structured way? So are there more formal ways that technology could help us? And I think the third one that is probably one of the more obvious ones, but certainly has a lot of complexity in it, is that as people are working from home, and as we're now coming out of these lockdowns and the quarantines and the restrictions of travel, we're starting to evolve into this work from anywhere concept and the remote working. And of course, there's one thing for someone to work from the office or work from home when it comes to the security of our documents, the security of our technology. It's another thing when we start facing it and saying, well, what's going to happen with all of that when we have people working from anywhere, in any country, or in the coffee shop down the road, and then the next day they're working from another location? How do we make sure that we continue to make to keep secure the documents and the materials that we have that are at a security risk if that came out? Is there a breach to our clients or our projects? We need to constantly maintain that. Now, we had that issue, that challenge pre-pandemic, but I think it is much more heightened now because we have so many more people engaging in this agile way of working than we did 2.5 years ago. So really it's those three issues. Of course, there's plenty of issues. I could keep talking for hours, but we do only have a certain amount of time for the podcast. But those three areas are certainly ones that are front of mind. And I think if we could find ways in which we can get technology to help, there's actually a correlation, particularly between that onboarding and the training of new people and supporting our leaders to engage our people and connecting them back with the business. If we get that mixture right, we know that the rest of it can flow on from there.
Thank you, Janelle. That really was very comprehensive. Three pointers though it may be. I think getting that mixture between technology and the softer side of HR isn't something that comes overnight. And certainly as regards retention and engagement and how to get our leaders, our managers to be able to interface with the staff in a way that doesn't subtract from what it was like pre-pandemic. And that's not to say that pre-pandemic, that sort of engagement was 100% perfect either. right? Getting that balance now is maybe more critical than ever. I think just because of how deep each of these issues are, I will intentionally start with the more technical side of what you just described, Janelle, and maybe talk about security. So this question's for both of you, Rob and Vidya, as regards security. So in general, to Janelle's point about more and more workforces around the world slowly moving back to the office, but even when we have, say, maybe half or 75% of the workforce still working from home or hybrid, what becomes then of the security risk that Janelle described in terms of document security or client data? Of course, nobody wants a scenario. The last thing anyone wants is someone working remotely that has never been physically met by management, running away with a laptop full of the intellectual property of either the client or indeed the employer themselves. What has your own experience been with this sort of issue, Rob and Vidya, and how might you propose this can be redressed, to Janelle's point on security?
Yeah, thanks, Graham. And I'll probably take a step back and just looking at the future of work. So there are essentially three elements of the future of work, and then I'll get to the question of answering around security. So one is in context to the flexibility of choices. So today, the norm, it's not even the new norm, but the normal is that there are flexibility of choices. Then there is freedom, which is given to people because they get to choose. I just saw an interesting video on LinkedIn where they said, okay, apart from the great resignation, is that people are probably not even applying for jobs that we put out there. So it's also the great demand that's setting in. And the third is focus on accountability. So really the flexibility, the freedom, and focus on accountability, these three are the principles which are driving the future of work as we see it. So coming to security, while there is a lot of freedom and flexibility which is given to people, the point on focus on accountability, as they say, with great powers comes great responsibilities. That accountability actually rests on not only employers but also individuals to be very, very mindful of security. So the way that we've seen, and we're a HR tech provider, so we're a company, we have an OKRs platform, we service companies globally, and the way we are seeing it is just as we are consumers of technology ourselves, we are also providing technology to others. So there are two things. One is from an employee perspective, getting them extremely sensitive to the fact that they are now using or responsible for data, and more responsible because they can actually be accessing the data anywhere, anytime. So a heavy amount of training and deep conversations with team members around the topic of security becomes imperative, irrespective of the size of the organization. And the second is in context to compliance, because there are a lot of compliance related either certifications or more out there, be it ISO 27001, Cyber GRX, and others, which technology vendors are now getting compliant with so that it gives that customer trust. So I would think it's both the compliance element as well as the conversations and training which is given to individuals to make them very sensitive to the fact that with that flexibility and freedom comes the great responsibility of focus on accountability, individual accountability. So this is what I would like to add on security.
Thanks,
Rob,
Vidya.
what do you think here?
Oh, look, thanks, Vidya. And look, you certainly lay the foundation very well for, I guess, the technology aspect that a risk officer or a technology officer would need to focus on. And most importantly, too, the responsibility of the employee community to provide a sense of commitment to security and compliance. But certainly we can take that deeper into the actual function of the Human Capital Management Office or the CHRO office. And when you think about HCM and you think about the processes of HCM, there are areas that are very highly compliant or have a requirement for very high compliance, particularly when we get into some of the high touch mission critical areas such as payroll, for instance, where we're holding critical data of employees. And most importantly, when we're paying them, we need to consider local compliance laws of the respective countries in which those employees reside, and all the appropriate reporting to the regulatory authorities that are associated with that. So I think the responsibility of security and compliance comes into the technology that's required to run those processes of human capital management itself. We as an organisation really understand the importance of this and the risk of not getting it right. We offer payroll services to about 150 countries across the globe, and we fully understand what it takes to be fully compliant, and it's not easy. So I would say that the human capital management business process, or the systems that provide that for organisations, really need to think about the compliance and the levels of security within the HCM application as well. And I think those two elements coming together, the infrastructure or the organisational security and risk policies, then combined with HCM software that really understands the concept of security and compliance itself, when they're combined, we have a very strong framework for organisations to feel that they have a good handle on this and can appropriately report to their stakeholders, be it the board or auditors or external evaluators, that they're certainly adhering to very high standards that are expected of them.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Excellent. So, I mean, what I'm hearing from all of you is that it does take both sides to get the security question answered correctly. Vidya touched on the fact that it's also the burden of the employee personally, from an accountability perspective of joining an organization, to understand that they are not just someone earning a wage, that they are also caretakers, custodians of data. So the element of getting them actually compliant with training is important, but also the important conversations around understanding the culture of being secure and being almost respectful of the fact that we are being entrusted with a certain amount of information and data as an organization that deals with external parties, chiefly clients, but also partners. And on the other side is the employer themselves. They have to ensure that they're personally accountable and institutionally accountable to look after security in terms of, Rob gave the great example of payroll, which of course requires layer upon layer of compliance. If anyone's ever actually sold payroll, it's one of the hardest things, even though it doesn't sound administratively terribly complex, it actually is from country to country. And I appreciate that answer. So it's good to know that, the idea of having both sides in the HR equation being accountable is something that can push the needle forward for compliance and risk and security as regards data management. Of course, in saying that and summarizing what each of you have said, the assumption is that we're able to even communicate that well with our workforce remotely. Even as we come out of lockdown, we make the assumption, of course, that we're able to get that level of engagement to facilitate conversations, important ones, certainly with security, but even at a more elemental level or early stage. Say, for example, when you have just hired someone remotely, Janelle was talking about how one of the biggest challenge was to figure out how to onboard people during the pandemic, new hires, and training them and keeping that engagement up, in spite of the fact that we lack those micro moments, those conversations that we might have at the water cooler, or just reaching over the cubicle in the office, etc. That sort of thing is still absent unless you're one of those organizations that have made the transition to complete work from office back into the office, which is still rare from at least my observations. So phrasing this now into a question for each of you, Rob and Vidya, with so many people working from home and then also transitioning back to the office, how can we ensure that even now there is enough done from an onboarding perspective to get people engaged even remotely, not only through access to systems, which is of course the baseline expectation, but how can technology help connect people quickly to the purpose and values of a business during the first few months of starting to get that baseline of engagement and communication done well?
Thanks, Graham. In my mind, you can't put the cart before the horse. So process always precedes technology. Janelle touched upon it in context to what's like the full circle of onboarding, and I completely agree with her. Because if you really look at placing the employee in the center in the full circle of onboarding, there is the onboarding to a manager, onboarding to a peer, onboarding to the company culture, onboarding to the role, and probably even integrating the family because now it's remote, right? And getting into back to the workplace. So if you really look at all these different elements coming to a full circle, um, technology should actually enable each of these elements. So if you look at onboarding software, in fact, I was just doing a study of how many HR tech companies are out there, since you mentioned the technology, not only the automation, but it needs to be a lot more deeper. And I noticed that in a marketplace like G2 Crowd, there are almost 35 categories of HR tech companies, probably thousands and thousands of players. And if you look at onboarding, there may be about 100 tools out there. But if you look at onboarding software, what has really significantly changed and is the point around connections. And I'll go back to what Janelle said, and she's spot on that, because the connection that you could enable through technology is by very, very simple elements, such as fun quizzes, YouTube videos for onboarding, get to know somebody remotely as they're coming back to work. So that's the fun side of it, to know somebody a lot better. And then there are, of course, these pulse checks, which we've been used to doing it for many, many years. This is not something new to HR, but doing that a lot more frequently at different moments of truth. So in my mind, if technology actually covers these elements, then you would have a superior onboarding experience, which people would remember. And it's really about making those memories of onboarding, which technology can enable.
Thanks, Vidya. And Rob, how do you feel about the application of technology to supplement that gap that we might be feeling when we try to remotely onboard or train someone that we've just gotten into the workforce during the pandemic?
Well, firstly, Graham, look, it's a great question about this challenge. Pre-COVID, I'm sure we'd agree that life was much easier in a typical work office environment to onboard people immediately into an immersive brand and cultural experience, to be surrounded by colleagues and team members, and to quickly and efficiently ramp up the induction into their role and the skills required to get them to full productivity. Now, the greater business challenge now in this new, work from anywhere world of work that we live in is, how do we quickly and effectively create real connections and reduce the time to productivity whilst trying to reinforce the organizational values and trying to create that immersive brand and cultural experience. Look, the employee onboarding challenge is certainly vastly different today, as employees are more dispersed and maybe working from different locations, whether at home, from the office, or in some cases even on site. So certainly investing in a digital onboarding infrastructure is a key to success in this new business environment. Manually tracking a new hire's progress can be extremely time consuming. And look, managers can do a lot today to automate and streamline the process with employee onboarding software. Talent management software, of course, helps to align the employee's performance, learning, and career development to the company's overall goals. So that certainly contributes to the onboarding process and trying to achieve those immersive brand experience goals. And certainly an onboarding portal or company intranet can be used to showcase company goals and values so new hires are aligned from the get-go. I'll just share some examples of how we provide technology to companies to help facilitate some of this. Firstly, look, facilitating a deeper understanding of the company culture, values, and goals can be embedded in the onboarding process via videos and certainly personalized welcoming messaging, throughout the onboarding process. There are technologies that we enable to help employees connect with their new teammates via bios, messaging, the ability to define your profile and the kind of interactions that you would like to have. And of course, continuing to leverage things like LinkedIn to understand each other and the history looking forward. We can conduct surveys personally and via Teams to understand the strengths and weaknesses of new employees so that we can take very proactive action and responses to make sure that their onboarding experience is very solid and very embracing. We can motivate new hires very quickly by very quickly helping them embrace a learning path to increase their skills, to increase their engagement. And of course, these courses can be assigned to communicate employee expectations as well, in line with articulating the company values as well. I think a very important point too is to leverage career planning processes that it should be available in modern HCM systems to very quickly embrace the new team member to reinforce their future in the company, I guess, and the company's commitment to them by way of career plan and career development. So there's certainly things that we see are very possible today by way of technology to not only help recruit, but to maintain those employees and help them get that experience of brand or brand experience that is a little harder to do in this remote work environment.
Thank you, Rob.
Pleasure.
What I'm hearing from both Vidya and Rob is that it takes two hands to clap as regards onboarding and training. We definitely have the software element to provide the infrastructure to do onboarding and training, but there is also process, and it takes both to work hand in hand together. On the one hand, you might have something for employee management software, but on the other hand, there is still an expectation for management to increase their communication with employees with expectations, to use Rob's example, and to paraphrase Vidya's statement about not putting the cart behind the horse. Process also comes first. Of course, we do understand that both process and software are critical now for remote onboarding. And that's one permutation of how to effectuate this pretty large task now in 2022. I'd like to ask each of you, and this is the last question we'll take before a break, Rob and Vidya, does that permutation for remote work as regards human capital management software and the processes, does that permutation look different when it comes to enabling and empowering our leaders to engage their staff, their workforce? Must we think of things in a different manner to get that working successfully?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, Graham. 90% of the conversations that we have at Fitbots is with leaders who are actually asking the very same question you just asked, is how do we really operate an organization in the new way of working with hybrid teams? And the conversations are moving more and more towards outcomes and alignment of teams. And if I just need to kind of go, double click on this point, is especially in the new way or the current way of work, leaders are looking at more accountability, not only from individuals, but also from teams. So some of the shifts that we've been seeing in companies from a leadership mindset is a shift from me to we. So instead of individuals and managers doing goal setting, how do teams come together with OKRs to actually make things happen? The second important conversation shift that we've been seeing is from tasks to outcomes, which is rather than measuring inputs. So for instance, running Google ad campaigns, writing 5 blogs, making 10 calls, writing an onboarding document, these are all inputs, but really the eye on the prize is, hey, have we increased the lead quality from, let's say, 10 to 50 in a week, or have we increased our pipeline from X to Y? So those are some of the outcomes that more and more, not only leadership, but even very early career folks are trying to speak in terms of the business language. So we're seeing that shift significantly as companies are adopting, let's say, a more agile way of working. The third important shift that we've been seeing is in context to the word leadership itself. And I'll go back to the point on accountability, because leadership actually could be saw levels. It could also be somebody in a very early career coming forward. Much like in Agile, you have Scrum Masters who are not the most senior most who are driving Scrum meetings, but it's very similar to what we're seeing in companies, where even folks who are in their very early career can come together, form check-in meetings and drive check-in meetings and report back to leadership as to how's the progress on outcome-based metrics. So we are seeing a lot of decentralization of these conversations across the organization. So I just thought I'd share that what we're seeing and sensing from the ground.
Thanks, Vidya. So from a process perspective, you see decentralization, you see a shift from tasks to outcomes, and a shift from me to we. From a software perspective, Rob, do any of those principles align with what Ceridian is doing from a software perspective in facilitating that? Or might you have a different view as regards engagement of our leaders?
Look, I think Vidya really summarized the trends in terms of what managers in this new world of work really need to consider. And I guess I could certainly complement that a little bit and then talk about how technology is helping managers embrace their behavior and the way they act in this new world of work. Managers, I think, certainly also, they need to adjust their style, and Vidya covered that brilliantly. One thing I think they need to do too is just put a renewed focus on inclusivity to avoid a workforce that can lead down the path of haves and have-nots, and especially in a distributed hybrid work environments. If you start getting a schism within the ranks of the workforce, it can certainly damage morale, it can damage engagement, it can have an impact on performance. And leaders need to keep putting an emphasis on keeping remote employees who aren't engaging at the office day to day, to keep them informed and included. And I really think that's where technology should be stepping in to provide the framework for doing so. And there's a number of, again, functions within a good HCM system that helps enable that connectivity with managers that's become more of a challenge. Firstly, we should always be testing the health as managers, even more often than we have in the past, by using employee surveys, for instance, to leverage employee engagement. And technology is available today to make that so much more frequent. And to make sure in doing so, that whole effort of doing so helps employees feel more welcome, supported, and valued. These technologies then help firms with their retention strategy by helping to identify problem areas as a result of these surveys and make more strategic decisions and being able to act more in a more agile fashion and make more strategic actions towards the employees. Then we extend into areas such as employee sentiment and analysis tools to help employees, for instance, understand their stress levels. One of the big things that we've experienced in surveying our customer base across the region is a high degree of burnout within the workforce. So it's very important as a result of COVID for organisations to really be testing the stress levels of their employees as well, and to try and deflate the impact of that with perhaps new programs, new insights and actions. Also think in the new world of work, it's very important that the business provides the manager a lot more meaningful data and insights into, again, the health of the workforce, and to identify or help identify any patterns or trends, both at the individual and team level, that may indicate that all is not well, either from a cultural perspective or a productivity perspective, or a cultural perspective for that matter, and to to, again, be able to take faster, more agile action to embrace employees and keep that brand experience and brand inclusion working very, very well. And certainly some big impacts to the positive side can be made by leveraging some of those functions and processes that are available today.
Thank you, Rob.
I just wanted to add to what Rob just mentioned in terms of insights, and I completely agree with him. The finer observations that we've had, especially when teams are using, let's say, a platform like Fitbots for OKRs, is, hey, which metrics are coming at risk a lot sooner than post facto after 90 days or 6 months? Who in the organization can help us move some of these forward? What experiments or tasks do we need to pick up in order to move some of the outcome metrics forward? So the energy in the conversations that we see towards outcomes is something that is very, very visible, especially, much like a GPS, they can actually see how exactly they are moving and where exactly are they going. So some of these visualizations through technology, it's very powerful, especially as people go from point A to point B. So I think this is one more observation I just wanted to add to what Rob just rightly mentioned in context to insights.
Thank you, Vidya, and thank you, Rob. You've both touched on the subject of using data in order to take a pulse check on what the workforce is feeling. And both of you, and you both are touching on words like health and morale. This actually very conveniently allows us to segue into the next topic, which Rob already actually highlighted, which is retention. We have reached the halfway mark of this recording. We do intend to bring this into a second episode. So for you out there in the audience, thank you for listening so far. We hope you learned something. Next up in our episode on the future of work, we are going to be discussing retention during the pandemic and arguably the greatest challenge we are facing from a HR perspective in 2022. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the British Chambers Podcast. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, and why not leave us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple, Google, and the other podcast platforms. For more information, please visit our website at www.britcham.org.sg and tune in next time for a brand new episode.